So I'm here today to talk about what to do after you've built a design system. But before I get into that, little introduction into myself. My name is Bethany. You can find me on Twitter as @Sonefeld, and this is my dog Oakley and I on Halloween last year. I'm pretty much obsessed with her, so if you follow me on Twitter, you'll definitely see her make an appearance on there. And I would love it if y'all could send me puppy gifs and dog gifs to my Twitter handle. I would love to see that after this talk. So I'm a UX designer at RetailMeNot currently, but previous to that, I was a design lead for the Carbon design system at IBM. And my responsibilities kind of ranged from a few different things like writing documentation to working on UX for the components to actually leading the day-to-day efforts of the team. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Carbon is the design system that powers the IBM Cloud platform. So if we look at that in terms of numbers, it's comprised of about 38 components, currently spread across 3 different libraries. And during my 2 years there, we onboarded about 90 teams to start using the design system. So we're all here at a design systems conference, right? And I feel like lately in the tech community, there's been a lot of talk about the importance of design systems, which makes me so happy to see that. But at the same time, there's a lot of education around how to build a design system and where do you get started. But no one's really going into depth talking about what happens afterwards. Cool, I've built this wonderful, beautiful thing. What do I need to do next? What are my next steps? So that's what I'm here to talk about today. And I feel like there's a big expectation out there, right? That it's cool, we built our design system, all the hard work is done, now we can just sit back, relax, and let people start using it, right? No, that's not necessarily the case. The reality is more something like this, where you're okay, we've built this great thing, super cool, and now we have a lot of added work on our plate, and we need to figure out what steps we need to take in order to maintain the system, create governance, increase adoption, all of those things that come with maintaining a design system, essentially. So the first topic I want to discuss is governance, and how do you create some process around your design system? And I think it's important to note that there's a few task items to put in place to help mitigate issues that may arise. And one of those things is having an issue template in place. So as people begin to use your design system, you're going to be getting a lot of requests coming in, whether they're in the form of an issue or a pull request. And having a template in place will really prevent people from just opening an issue saying hey, this dropdown is broken. That's not telling us anything, right? So in your issue template, it's important to outline the things that your system team needs to know in order to properly triage or prioritize this issue. So this could be a variety of things like, what browser are you working in? What version of the components are you using? A detailed description of what problem you're actually having. Screenshots, code snippets, those things are all huge so that you can get insight into the problem that this person's having. And once you have a template in place, it actually makes it a lot easier for your systems team to kind of groom your backlog, prioritize issues, because they'll begin to look very similar. And so if you're using GitHub to manage your system, GitHub makes it really easy for us to do this, so thank you to GitHub for that. All you have to do is open a markdown file that lives in your .github folder called issue template, and then as a user, when I go in to open a new issue, it's already pre-filled out with some information that I know the systems team is requiring of me. So I know that they need to know these things from me before I even go to submit this new issue. So another task item that I want to talk about when it comes to establishing process is having a code of conduct in place. And honestly, I feel like this is often overlooked, but it's so important. And the TLDR of it is just don't be an a-hole. Be a decent human being, right? But it's also going to help your team establish some communication best practices, which will help prevent things like this from happening, right? Where Joe is at hearing and at channeling for every small message or question that he has. Please don't be like Joe. Don't do this. I have a very strong philosophy on when to use at here or at channel. And it's reflected in this handy dandy chart that I haven't shared out yet publicly, but if anyone would like a copy, I will happily give it to you. But no, like in all seriousness, when you work at a company the size of IBM, where you have thousands of people in one Slack channel that are spread across like multiple different time zones, it's not a good scenario when you're waking someone up at 2 in the morning because of a question that you have. So setting these boundaries in place, setting communication best practices is really important when it comes to having a code of conduct. But having a code of conduct will also outline things like what you envision your community to be around your design system. So you want one that's respectful and courteous, welcoming and open. You want it to be a safe space where people feel comfortable asking questions and submitting feedback and things like that. And it's important to also host your code of conduct somewhere that can easily be referenced. So for us, we had it on our GitHub repositories, and then we pinned it to our Slack channels. So we would frequently reference it anytime someone may be violating it. Just, casual reminder that this exists and that it's really important to us. So I want to address this question that I get asked a lot when it comes to governance around your design system. And that's really, like, how do you enforce the design system? How do you get people to use the patterns and the components properly and make sure they're not modifying them? And I'm always like, okay, well, step one, don't be the design police, right? Like, don't pick apart or reprimand someone for not following the patterns properly. Instead, if you see something, say something, right? So communicate with that person, try to understand why they may be modifying these components. Oftentimes, I felt that it was a flaw on the systems team where we were like, oh, we didn't think of that use case. So this happened quite frequently, actually, where we saw components being modified in production, and we were like, wait a second, that looks different than what was in our design system. So we had to set this process in place called a component check-in. So these happened on a bi-weekly basis, and honestly, at first, people came to us and were like, oh, these meetings are just so that you can approve or deny our designs. And we're like, no, that's not it at all. Like, we're trying to learn from you. We're trying to learn from our product designers and developers about what's working, what's not working. So that's really what this space became, is for a chance for our users of the design system to communicate with them, for us to share out changes that were up and coming, things like that. And once we had this in place, we saw people not modifying the components as much because we were working with them in a more collaborative manner. So now that you've got some processes in place, let's talk about adoption and how do you get people to use the things that you've actually built. And I feel like there's an expectation out there that you're going to work really hard to build something and you're going to ship it and release it, and then without you having to do anything, like, people are just going to start using it right away. And that's not necessarily the case. I think that adoption is not a linear path. There's going to be a lot of ups and downs. You may even wallow in self-pity at some point, which I may or may not have done. And I have a very strong philosophy about adoption of design systems, and that's that they shouldn't be mandated. And we always followed this mantra on the Carbon team because we wanted people to feel enabled and confident in adopting the system. And if you think about it, design systems are a set of tools that are enabling people to work smarter, not harder. They're enabling people to be more efficient. And whenever you are mandating that someone use a set of tools, there's already some animosity that sets in. So we always said, okay, we're not going to mandate this, but we're going to work with people to, show off the value of what the system has to offer. So with this being said, I do have 4 secrets that I want to share for how we increase adoption across IBM and how you can do the same. Secret number 1 is just be available. I know it sounds kind of simple, but honestly, just like answering people's questions in a timely manner on Slack or email, just letting them know that there's a team behind this thing is really important to help you build credibility. Secret number 2 of increasing adoption is to provide all the documentation that you can think of. So this can range anywhere from getting started guides to component usage guidelines to migration guides, how someone's going to upgrade to the latest and greatest version. And I love this quote by Rune Madsen, who says that if marketing can't read the docs to figure out which color and typeface to use in a Word document, then you have failed. And I had to remind myself of this I feel like the first 8 months of my time on the Carbon team was like writing documentation. And I had to remind myself that like, okay, it's not just for designers and developers. There's gonna be content strategists, there's going to be marketing teams, product managers that are going to be reading this, and we have to make it make sense to them. Step 3 of increasing adoption is to show your value. So I talked about this a little bit earlier, but design systems are really cool. Like, be proud of all the things that it has to offer to your product teams and your users. It can range from built-in accessibility patterns to an increase in page performance speed to a decrease in UI inconsistencies. Whatever those things are, like, demo them and be really cool, proud and show off all the cool things that your system has to offer. And then step 4 of increasing adoption is to over-communicate. So we set this cadence that we are gonna publish our roadmap, and by publish, I mean like post on Slack and link it to GitHub. But basically, we established this cadence of publishing our roadmap 3 to 4 months before any big version release. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to build credibility and trust with teams so that they knew what was coming down the pipeline, they knew what they needed to do to upgrade. And really, again, communicating frequently and often with teams is so important. So if you think about all of these 4 secrets combined with like a lot of time and a lot of patience, I think will ultimately lead to building trust, which in my eyes is the key factor for how you're going to increase adoption across your product team or your organization. So while you're working hard trying to get people to use the things that you've built, you can't forget about the maintaining aspect of a design system, right? So bug fixes are going to be a big part of that. Hate to break it to you. And if you're trying to fix all the bugs on your own, like just the systems team, without relying on any outside contributors, you're not going to have a very nice time. So please don't try to do that. Which is why it's important to have a contribution process in place, right? So that when people do come to you and say, hey, I found a solution for this thing, you're like, great, look at our contribution process, submit a pull request, whatever it may be, you have to find what works for you. And we found what worked for the Carbon team was having a few different levels of contribution, right? Because we had designers come to us or content strategists and say like, hey, I found a typo on the website. And we're like, oh, cool, like, let's fix that right away. But they weren't comfortable submitting a pull request. So we had to find a few different ways that all of our audience could feel enabled and confident contributing back. Continuous improvement is also a big part of maintaining. And I want you to remember that a design system's never done, right? It's gonna be constantly improving and iterating and growing as your product team or your organization grows as well. So I wanna tell y'all a story about how once upon a time, our team decided to build like one of the most complex components known to man. And anyone here that's worked on data tables can vouch for me when I say that it's like a very difficult beast to tackle in terms of both design and code. And our product team, IBM Cloud, they utilize a lot of data tables to display information, so we knew we had to get this component right. So what we did was we built our first version of data tables, and it was pretty lightweight, but it got the job done. The most important thing was like getting something out there and getting something shipped so that teams could start using it, adopting it, things like that. So we did that, we shipped our first version, and then we started to get questions like this. How do I remove the zebra stripes from the Carbon table? Do we have a pattern for batch actions on the data table? What's the pattern for sorting in a data table? And I feel like our whole team kind of did one of these, like, oh, shit. Yeah, we don't know the answers to these things. And that was because we were so focused on like rapidly building and iterating and getting something out there that we didn't really take the time to like stress test this component and communicate with our product teams. So what we had to do was take a big step back and say, okay, what are all of the needs that we know exist from our product teams? Let's aggregate those. Let's go through a 3 to 4 month design overhaul where we're literally going to bring in sponsor users, engineers, product designers, and involve them in our critiques. Like, invite them to these things, invite them to poke holes in our design, and really just trying to get to a point where we felt confident in what we were shipping next. So what we ended up with was version 2 of data tables, which unfortunately contained a lot of breaking HTML changes to the code because we restructured it, but we worked with teams to actually upgrade to this version because we felt that this provided a lot more functionality, a lot more styling flexibility, and we were actually confident in what we had shipped this time around. So the moral of that story is that, do your best the first go, but plan for those refactors, plan for those upgrades. You're always going to be making those small improvements, whether they're at the size of this or they're just changing a small color here or there. All right, so the last topic that I want to talk about is one that's near and dear to my heart because I feel like it's one of the most beautiful parts about working on a design system is seeing it grow and really continue to flourish. And part of that growth is really thinking strategically about the future of your system, which is why it's so important to have a roadmap in place, right? That you're figuring out like, okay, where are we gonna be 6 to 8 months from now? How are we gonna get to where we need to be? But having a roadmap is also important so that you can align with your product's needs, which leads me to my next point, and that's when you're thinking about strategy and thinking about the future of your system, remember to focus on your product team's needs or your organization's needs. The reason I say this is because in the world we live in today, it's very easy to get competitive and say, oh, there's all these design systems out there that have X, Y, and Z, so we need to have those things as well. And that's just not true. Your design system is serving your product team's needs, and if you're not doing that, then ultimately you're failing. So these things are all wonderful. You can look at them for inspiration, but don't look at them as competition. And part 2 of growth is thinking about the team culture that you're creating and cultivating. And something that was really important to our team culture on Carbon was to have time to innovate. So we had these Thursday morning, we call them hack times, where we brought in coffee and bagels, and it was just a time for us to all get in a room together. Sometimes we watched movies, sometimes we built cool stuff, but it was really just about making time to get away from our day-to-day of fixing bugs and maintaining these components and just researching a new animation library or whatever it may be. And we really use this as like our sacred team time. And the last thing that I want to leave y'all with is just remembering to celebrate your wins throughout this whole process. I was always the person on the team that was like super extra, and I would bring in like champagne or cake or anything for like any small accomplishment or win that I felt that we had, or like, let's take a team day. Like whatever that may be, it's important that you're taking time to pat yourself on the back, to celebrate your wins, and to be proud of the work that you've done. And I always think about how like 10 to 15 years from now, I'm not gonna look back and be like, yes, I worked on the data table component, and that was great. I'm gonna remember like the relationships that I've built with people and the talented team that I was surrounded by. So when you're thinking about what to do after you've built a design system, try not to get too caught up in like, how do I increase adoption and create governance and maintain all these components and fix the bugs? Just remember to like have fun throughout it all, you guys. It's a great opportunity to work on design systems, and it's a time that I'll always look back on as a great time in my life. So thanks, y'all.